Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you in the UK at least. Good morning, good evening to those in other time zones, and welcome to this webinar in which we're going to explore this question of what is cyber statecraft. This is a launch event for a new research project called Cyber Statecraft in an Era of Systemic Competition, which we've abbreviated in typical academic fashion to Cycraft. It's a collaboration between RUSI, which has been kind enough to host today's webinar, the University of Bath and King's College London. I'm Dr. Tim Stevens. I'm Associate Professor in International Security at King's College London and the Principal Investigator for the Cycraft project. It's funded by the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory here in the UK, the STL, through the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, in partnership with the Research Institute for Sociotechnical Cyber Security, which is one of the government-sponsored cybersecurity research institutes. We're also working closely with the National Cyber Security Centre and others. So thank you very much to all of our project partners. I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly in a moment, but first just to say some, by way of background, a little bit about the project. And the backdrop to the project is systemic competition amongst nations for authority, influence, and control in global cyberspace. And as you'll be well aware, there are competing visions of global cyber governance and conflicting interpretations of what is permitted and what is not in this environment. And cyberspace offers challenges for what it means to be sovereign, what forms of power are permissible or desirable, how international law applies, the role of the private sector, and many other important conceptual and practical questions for the digital 21st century. The UK's overall approach to this, to navigating this complex and dynamic environment, revolves around, yes, of course, the pursuit of national interests, but in ways that demonstrate and affirm the central notion of responsible democratic cyber power. And this means aligning words with actions so that the exercise of sovereign power in practice reflects and supports the UK's stated adherence to international law and to norms of responsible state behaviour in cyberspace. And this is not always straightforward, and it's occasioned much reflection in the community about how this should be undertaken. But collectively, we saw this as an opportunity to explore what it means to conduct statecraft in this field. And statecraft is an old term, one with many definitions, but most resolved to something like the art of conducting state affairs. It's more than just diplomacy or foreign policy. It's more than military or intelligence operations, more than trade and finance. But all of those actions the UK obviously undertakes in cyberspace, and to which in general it's a net contributor in terms of ideas and leadership. And of course, the UK's approach also recognises that there are other important actors in this environment, including non-state actors like civil society and companies, some of which conduct statecraft-like activities and perhaps even harbour state-like ambitions. There's also a large number of what we call middle ground countries between the poles of the US and the like-minded allies on one side and the Sino-Russian bloc on the other. And what are their statecraft opportunities, and how can the UK respond to them and perhaps encourage them in ways that align with UK's national objectives? Cycraft project as a whole aims to understanding this landscape of statecraft and to feed back into UK thinking about how to develop its international cyber statecraft now and in the coming years. And we've assembled a panel today, which I hope will address some of these questions and many more. I'll go through them in turn. We have Nikita, who works for HM Governments in cyber policy. And Nikita will be very well known to a lot of us in the cybersecurity community as a consistent supporter and enabler of academic work in this space. We have Dr. Andrei Burinia, Senior Lecturer in International Relations from the University of Bath, who's a co-investigator on the Cycraft project. He's an expert in cyber diplomacy, amongst other cybersecurity issues, and Andrei leads the research team engaging with the theory, practice, and evaluation of cyber statecraft. Louise Marie Harel is a research fellow at RUSI and co-investigator on the Cycraft project, principally focused in this case on the role of the private sector in cyber statecraft, which reflects some of her groundbreaking research into how private actors take on state-like postures and attitudes in global cyber governance. And also welcome to Conrad Prince, very well known to the RUSI community, is a RUSI Distinguished Fellow and Senior Cyber Advisor. And Conrad has a wealth of experience and expertise gained from senior roles in UK intelligence and policy. So very much welcome to you all. The format for today's discussion is for approximately the first 40 minutes or so. It's a discussion with the panel, a conversation, if you like, between project members and our close colleagues. That will be on the record. It will then be followed by a question and answer session, which will be off the record. And please drop any questions you have in the Q&A function on Zoom. You're free to upvote questions as well, if you like the look of ones that other people have asked, and then we'll take a selection of those and put them to the panel for the last third of today's presentation. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to turn to Nikita first, if I may. From your perspective within UK government, what are the current conversations, if you like, around what we are calling cyber statecraft for the purposes of this project? What questions and themes are emerging from within government itself about the likely contours of cyber statecraft looking ahead?
Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you to colleagues as well for the opportunity to discuss cyber statecraft. It's a really kind of useful question to kick off, I think, Tim. So I think a lot of our policy discussions around cyber statecraft are most likely driven by the notion of responsible and democratic cyber power. The first observation I'd make is they're very much driven as a cross-departmental effort. So I think something that we're quite good at doing as a government is really ensuring that we're looking at the full breadth of levers to the UK government in this space. As you hinted at in your introduction, whether that's diplomatic levers, military, trade, some of our domestic resilience levers, etc., intelligence and law enforcement too. What we really try to do is look across the full breadth of those, understand how they join up and how together those enable the UK government to both protect and promote its interests in cyberspace. So I think something we've really tried to capture is the full range of what we're able to do in cyberspace, and also kind of gaps, perhaps vulnerabilities as well, areas where we need to keep revisiting and revitalizing our thinking as we go along. I think the interesting thing with cyber power is that I think when the concept or the narrative first came into being, it was very much driven in the international laws and norms space. So really thinking about how it is that the UK is able to work with its international partners to push forwards this narrative of responsible cyber power. And since then, we've done a lot of work to broaden out that narrative. So really thinking about how we link it to a domestic context, also thinking about some of the feedback and challenges we've perhaps received on the narrative as well, and trying to capture a broader range of voices in the narrative too. And then briefly, I just thought I'd perhaps reflect a little bit on future challenges that we're facing, all of which I think plays into how we think about both cyber statecraft and responsible cyber power as well. Some of the key challenges that not just the UK government really, but some of our private sector partners, for example, or even our close international partners face, is things like how do we constantly keep refining our statecraft in response to an incredibly fast-paced and increasingly sophisticated threat landscape in cyberspace? How do we also think about longer-term or more consistent challenges, such as skills, for example, and looking at the wider cyber ecosystem and profession that we're trying to build? How do we think about the challenges and opportunities posed by securing new and emerging technologies? Things like the vulnerability of supply chains. And I think increasingly something that's definitely become a notable shift in the UK narrative is our emphasis on economic security and resilience. So really thinking about that as another facet of what cyber statecraft is trying to achieve in the context of the UK's wider domestic goals. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nikita. That covers a really wide range of potential activities that might be covered by this term cyber statecraft. And we'll come back to some of those themes shortly. If I could turn to you now, Andre, you're looking in your work package as I mentioned earlier, the theory, practice, and evaluation of cyber statecraft. If you could just unpack that a little bit and tell us what we're trying to learn about the cyber statecraft landscape and how this project is going to contribute and develop some of those ideas further.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, we're trying to do three things in the project, and definitely in our work package, which, as you rightly said, is more directly related with the conceptualization of cyber statecraft. The first thing we are trying to do is obviously to conceptualize, to unpack the concept, as you say, to understand the connection with other concepts such as cyber power, for example. And that's an exercise that, as I'll say in a second, has taken us, I think, more time than we expected so far, because it's quite interesting how many people talk about statecraft, less about cyber statecraft, but very few have actually defined it and unpacked the concept in terms of the multiple aspects. The other thing we're obviously trying to do associated with this is to map and understand the actors that within the UK context participate in this cyber statecraft effort. We're doing this beyond the UK, but I think Louise will have the opportunity to talk a bit more about that. And finally, obviously, we want to use our research to inform policy and future research and help build national capacity. So, as I said, part of the issue with the definition of statecraft, so this is not an issue exclusive to cyber statecraft, this is an issue that has to do with the more well-established definition of statecraft, is that a lot of the definitions focus on what it does and what it enables, but very few actually focus on what it is. And so I think this is where we are currently struggling. You mentioned David Baldwin's definition of statecraft as the art of conducting state affairs. Others talk about statecraft as the organized actions of governments that take regarding to its external environment. I would say that when it comes to cyber statecraft, and Jason Healy was one of the first authors to talk about the concept. He talks about cyber statecraft as the overlap between cyberspace and the art, as you say, the art of government and diplomacy. Especially but not solely for issues of national and international security practiced by states and non-states. Our definition, the definition we have so far developed in the project, and because we are still halfway through the first year, this is still a working definition. The definition we have is cyber statecraft as the combination of multiple strategic approaches for securing the national interest in and through cyberspace, using all levers of national power. It's quite interesting that Nikita mentioned levers so much in her intervention, and marshalling the private sector and civil society in a whole of society efforts. And so I just point out three things here. The first one is that cyber statecraft is not the same as strategy or grand strategy in cyberspace. I think it goes beyond both concepts. It's broader than that. You can have multiple strategies within the cyber statecraft effort. It also has an intimate relation with the external. It's about achieving national goals, about achieving national interest, but outward facing. Obviously, when it comes to cyberspace, as we all know, it often is very difficult to distinguish the external from the internal. And particularly in our definition, when we talk about this definition or this understanding of whole of society effort. So this cannot be accomplished without taking into consideration all the actors that are outside government, outside the state, but that are quite essential, quite relevant, and in some cases fundamental for the UK in this case, or any other state, to achieve its goals. And the private sector has a particular role to play here, but it's not only the private sector, civil society, academia, and all the other stakeholders that are intimately related with this whole of society effort. So just to conclude, I think when we're trying to inform the debate, when we're trying to inform the discussion around cyber policy, I think providing this conceptual toolbox to better understand how cyber statecraft works and what it does and what it is will be probably one of our most relevant contributions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andre. I mean, I think it's quite notable, isn't it? I mean, we started talking about cyber power in the late 2000s, And it's only really in the last handful of years that it's resurfaced as something that's actually central to a lot of policy in this space. And you know, Jay Healy's work is 10 years old now, right? And but so nobody has taken the trouble, it seems to me, to sit down and work out what this cyber statecraft might be in both theoretical and empirical terms. So you know, I'm very much hoping that your theme there is going to produce some more concrete understanding of cyber statecraft. Again, we'll return to some of the themes you raised there. But if I could turn to Louise now, is this a peculiarly UK way of looking at cyber statecraft, or is there something more generalizable here, do you think, when we think about different geographies and polities, that we could, I mean, you have a great deal of regional experience with Latin America and Brazil in particular. Is this something that resonates further afield?
I think terminology is very important here. And that's why I think, you know, the work that Andre and the colleagues over at Bath are going to do is quite important. Also domestically within the UK, I think Nikita very well pointed that the discussion around cyber power, right? The UK being a democratic and responsible cyber power. At first, it was a term that was sought to, you know, transition in places and to circulate in international kind of negotiations and spaces. So places like the open-ended working group at the UN, right? But when it landed, it didn't land quite well, because when we're talking about cyber power, right, it almost feels that one has cyber power and other countries might not. So it creates that terminology by design as creating inequalities as to who has and who hasn't. And I think when we talk about cyber statecraft, potentially this is another way of having a more productive conversation. And I'd say that I kind of you know, I kind of react to Andre's, you know, evolving definition, and we've discussed that before, Andre. Which is, I do think that it's about the practices and how these different governments seek to organize their way of influencing and shaping their cyber governance. And of course, I mean, from a regional perspective, right, looking at Latin America and Brazil, India, and South Africa are three of the cases that work package 2 of this project is looking at, right? It is important to understand and contextualize how these countries actually see their influence, how they organize their institutions, and why do they sometimes prioritize one particular approach rather than others. Of course, the geopolitical context right now does not necessarily provide for the most, at the political level, the most fruitful conversation, or let's say the most open conversation about those differences. But nonetheless, I think that's the value of the research that we're doing here, is actually going deep into at least 3 countries that have been framed as, you know, emerging powers or middle ground countries, and to see how they have consolidated their approaches. Especially from a Brazilian standpoint, which is one of the cases. If we look at that, you know, the development of cyber capacities and capabilities have institutionally been concentrated in the president's office and in the cyber command, right? It's only in the past couple of years that has been kind of diffused to broader parts of the government because of a series of incidents. So that begs the question of how these countries have evolved in their way of consolidating institutionally and externally their views around statecraft. Brazil was the first country in Latin America to publish its views on how international law applies to cyberspace. Costa Rica went after that as the second country doing that, but that was probably because Conti kind of triggered a series of reflections at the domestic level. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of research to be done to understand how cyber statecraft is a term and a concept that is useful beyond a particular and very specific number of countries.
And I guess part of that task, as it were, is to understand that not everything resolves to conventional geopolitics read through the lens of the US versus Russia and China, right? Countries like Brazil have, you know, local and regional concerns. for which they have statecraft responses and objectives. And in fact, as we've seen from the cyber conflict literature, most cyber conflict is much more regional than perhaps it is often read through the lens of the kind of US and the like-minded versus China and Russia. I think there's a lot of interesting empirics and ideas to come out of that. If I could just stay with you for a moment, Louise, and then I'll turn to Conrad. Louise, you're looking in this project as well at the private sector. Now, when we use the word statecraft, and then we turn to non-state actors to look at their role in all this, how do we square that away as academics and as a policy community? What's the relationship between the private sector and statecraft?
Well, I mean, if you let me, I'll go on and on about this, but I think you said it very nicely, Tim, which is the term in itself it indicates who we're speaking to, the agent, right? It's statecraft. And obviously, when we talk about statecraft or cyber statecraft, we're talking about concepts of state legitimacy that are linked to territory, to international recognition, to the monopoly of violence. So your traditional kind of let's say denominators of configuring what supports that statecraft and who can perform statecraft. But it's undeniable that even from a state-centric perspective, that the private sector has been a key element to understanding contemporary, especially contemporary cybersecurity politics. But states have leveraged historically industry and other parts, different types of companies to extend their power, both domestically and internationally. So think about the 15th and 16th century. That was fundamental for the UK to have mercantile companies to expand the drive. It was a driving force in Britain's kind of colonial expansion, right? So that is a way in which the UK has kind of used that historically, that power of the private sector to project itself, to be an extended arm of those kinds of practices in a post-Cold War kind of scenario, right? There was the Nisour Square massacre in 2007. It became evident that the US was using Blackwater, right? So defense contractors being another example. So we're not looking at something that's necessarily new, but I think if we want to understand contemporary cybersecurity politics, if we want to understand how cybersecurity governance and more specifically statecraft is conducted, it's very hard to see how can we can exclude the private sector from that. And I think there's some underlying factors that leads us, especially in this research, to that point. Historically speaking as well, right? So I think with the end of the Cold War, there is a systemic privatization. A result of that has also been that there's, a privatization of security, and that has ultimately influenced, cybersecurity being a growing market. You have a market consolidation of cybersecurity companies since, I don't know, the 1980s, and then now a market that's kind of like your big tech companies aggregating more and more services related to cybersecurity. So we need to position the discussion around why are we talking about the private sector as either an actor that supports cyber statecraft, or an actor that contests, or an actor that even performs state-like activities, given the perennial kind of presence of their software and services across government, right, and society. If we start to ask each other here who's using which kind of operational system, it will be a handful of them, right? That's because it's an infrastructural kind of power that they exert, some of very specific companies. And I don't know if that consolidation will stop. It probably will just expand, but we still need to look at how core private actors have been engaging, and also your emerging models have been kind of also shaping cyber statecraft. I can talk more and more about that, about different ways in which, of course, we see the private sector, the cybersecurity markets engaging, right? You can go from public-private partnerships, lobbying, corporate social responsibility to, your your everyday kind of news headlines, how companies have been engaging international organizations, international support for crisis response, such as Ukraine, disrupting networks of transnational criminal groups, such as, botnet takedowns or ransomware takedowns, remediation of software vulnerabilities. And I'm happy to kind of like talk about examples around that, but I think it's inevitable that a continuation of this project is understanding statecraft beyond your usual state as the key actor for conducting statecraft. So looking at that contestation and support of the private companies in enhancing that influence. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And of course, I think Keller Easterling wrote a book called Extra Statecraft, which was all about the infrastructural power of non-state companies and so on. So maybe there's something to explore in that kind of term as well. Thank you. Just a reminder to participants that they're welcome to drop questions into the Q&A function. We've had a couple already, but let's see where we get to with those. Conrad, you've been very patient. I just wonder if I could turn to you, and what are you hearing here as somebody with very long experience of working with, well, for UK government? What are you hearing that can enhance, if you like, both government's understanding of what it's doing, but also contributing to how it develops the ideas as it looks ahead to some of the challenges that Nikita articulated earlier?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Tim, and it's great to be here. I mean, I think I was really struck, by some of the things Nikita was saying. And I come at this as a kind of former practitioner rather than as an academic expert in the field. But I was very struck about the breadth of the things Nikita was talking about under this banner of cyber statecraft. We're talking including things like skills, new and emerging technology, economic resilience. And I do sort of wonder, where, with a cyber power, where is cyber statecraft going? For those who are, trained spotters of evolving ways in which the UK expresses its engagement in cyber, are we detecting a shift here? And I think that's a really interesting set of questions, because I guess, I had come to this thinking a bit much more in a kind of external context. I suppose in a kind of traditional way, again, as a non-expert, one would think of statecraft. This feels like a much more holistic set of things than that. So that's been really interesting and striking for me. I think if you look at the UK, I would say, and if we look at some of the more external dimensions, I think we've seen the UK, playing an increasingly active part, certainly internationally, in statecraft, in kind of, both of Jason Healy's old definitions of it, advancing interest in cyberspace and using cyberspace. And I think we've seen the way that the UK diplomatic network around cyber has grown very significantly. There's a lot more engagement now internationally. There's a lot of work focusing around, what you describe and what is described as those middle ground states. And I think that sort of raises, that's kind of positive, but it raises some challenges for the UK. I think, challenges is we've got to be consistent here in what we're investing in our effort internationally. We've got to have a credible presence, and the more and more that we extend ourselves in this area, the more challenging it is. And maybe this comes back to some of Nikita's points about skills. We've got to have a commitment to the long haul in terms of engaging internationally on some of these really critical issues around cyber. And I think we've got to have a kind of credible offer here, particularly when we're engaging with middle ground states who are looking at, a number of competing visions for cyberspace, and ours may not be the most compelling from that point of view. So, I think this is a really fascinating area for the UK to be focusing on and developing its thinking in. As always, it's about how we back that up practically, internationally. And I think just one other point, I was really interested in hearing, Louisa's comments about the roles of the private sector here. And of course, Ukraine and the way the private sector has leapt in to support Ukraine in a really impressive and I think significant way is fascinating. I think it raises some interesting questions for those private sector companies as to how comfortable they are now with becoming caught up in a kind of a statecraft environment, and where that leaves them, and whether that makes them actually feel more vulnerable and more uncertain, concerned about the implications for their, the commercial relationships elsewhere in the globe, concerns about where that leaves them perhaps as a target. And I think there's also some really interesting questions around the way in which the private sector has operated in the context of Ukraine and how transferable that is elsewhere. Because, you know, I think once we move into a kind of China-Taiwan scenario, the private sector dimensions of statecraft, like all of those dimensions, are going to potentially look very different. So it's a really fascinating area and some really interesting challenges here for the UK. Thank you.
Thanks, Conrad. Yeah, I think that points to a really interesting aspect of this. You know, even if we have a very provisional understanding of statecraft as something that is more art than science, it speaks to that contextual element you hinted at there in respect to the difference between Ukraine and Taiwan. I know you're principally talking about firms, but actually, you know, statecraft is strategic. And strategy must be flexible. Even if, you know, national interests win out, precisely how you go about achieving those is different on a case-by-case basis, right? I'm just going to go back around the panel and ask Nikita in the first instance to respond, if you like, to what Conrad has just suggested in terms of, you know, there's a resourcing element to this. Is there a dilution if the UK is trying to do too much in this space? Or, you know, where does the focus lie and how do we manage the inevitable tensions between ambitions and resources?
Thanks, Tim. I think that's a really interesting point because if you look at where we are in our life cycle, I suppose, when it comes to national cyber strategies, so we launched our last one in late 2021. That runs through to 2026, so the UK National Cyber Strategy, and that's the third iteration of official UK government thinking on cyber. You know, we're getting to that point where we naturally have to start thinking about what happens beyond 2026, and that's where I think it almost brings into a practical setting those questions around ambition versus resource versus you know, are we trying to do too much as opposed to a much more targeted approach to cyber statecraft. I think what's really challenging is that we're always led, at least in the cyber policy world, by wider national goals. And so if I'm rooting my thinking in the integrated review, then we deliberately have to be quite holistic and we have to be broad, because we're essentially looking at cyber as a means of enabling longer term UK domestic national goals. So whether that's the pursuit of the UK as a broader science and tech superpower, whether it's in pursuit of enhancing the UK's domestic resilience against a wider set of threats, whether it's in support of the UK's foreign policy goals, for example, and say, you know, the increased kind of risk appetite by Russia or the systemic challenge posed by China. Those are all, I suppose, the drivers of what makes the UK's approach to cyber statecraft so bold. So I think Conrad points to the right set of questions. You know, how do we make a compelling offer to some of the other countries that we're trying to encourage to adopt responsible behaviours in cyberspace? How do we offset resources against ambition? And, you know, how do we increasingly do that in a world where we are constrained, whether it's by kind of public finances, the amount of people that we have in the profession, etc. Those are all really valid challenges. I don't have an explicit answer for now, I suppose, but I think part of it for me is also how do we keep the narrative relevant? So if we think about all of the different audiences that we're trying to cater to when it comes to cyber statecraft, on the one hand, we have a UK domestic audience. We also have our international partners, including the middle grounds. We then have our adversaries that we're trying to signal to. I think each of those determine the different directions that we have to go in. And therefore, I suppose we're deliberately being quite broad in how we respond to these things. You know, I would also add in the challenges around things like sustainability, for example. If we're thinking about climate change and what responsible government behaviour in cyberspace looks like, we do have to think about the long-term challenges posed by the environment too. So I'm probably, I suppose this is a very inadvertent or indirect way of saying, I think we will deliberately carry on a broad approach, but I think we'll be led by wider government direction in trying to kind of achieve that balance between resource, ambition, and long-term pursuit of our wider national goals.
Thank you. And perhaps in a slightly geeky fashion, someone like myself who has been looking at national cybersecurity strategy for quite a long time, it's noticeable how much more strategic it has become. When you go back to the 2009, it was kind of the first cut under a completely different administration, and the 2011 strategy had almost everything you could possibly imagine in it. And subsequently, it's been much more closely linked to national security strategy and indeed to almost a grand strategy at times, and much more focused. But at the same time, it is broad. But I think arguably the range of issues that are now we encounter in this environment has probably somewhat increased or at least intensified over that period. I just wanted to turn to Andre briefly, thinking back to both what Conrad said and then to Nikita's response. What are the key analytical challenges here? Coming at it as an academic with a lot of experience looking at things like governance and diplomacy and power and so on.
Thanks. I'd say there's quite a few, starting with what are the dimensions that should be included and dimensions that should be excluded when talking about cyber statecraft. As Conrad rightly pointed out, it seems that we are talking about a much more holistic understanding of what goes on in terms of cyber policy, and therefore it becomes more difficult to separate what should be included from what should be excluded. And I think that is an exercise that involves understanding what are the actors that contribute to achieving that national interest outward facing. And I think that may be a way of going about this. So obviously the domestic component is quite important, but I think there is this outward facing dimension that is still crucial to statecraft. The other really difficult challenge, and Louisa has pointed out this multiple times, is how are we going to integrate the idea of power with the idea of statecraft, particularly, and Tim, you've written extensively about this, how we understand cyber power, which is a concept that, as Nikita mentioned, has been at the forefront of UK policy. How is that part of this broader cyber statecraft effort? And so I think those two are the main challenges. But if I can just react on a couple of points, if I may, I think the vocabulary of cyber statecraft and the use of this terminology indicates something here, which is, I think, a maturing of the discussions around international cybersecurity. I think having countries like Brazil and Costa Rica assuming positions in terms of how international law applies in this domain involves or indicates a certain level of additional commitment and responsibility from these states vis-a-vis this domain, right? This is a domain where for many years, quite a lot of states just fudged their way around it. They avoided having, particularly at the middle and lower level, they avoided having a position. They didn't really want to participate in a lot of the discussions. And more we see this need to be more assertive, and with it means you need to be more responsible. And so I think cyber statecraft brings a language of responsibility to the discussions around cyber policy, because it obliges states to indicate what are their preferences, how they're going to achieve it, and what they think should and should not be done. And I think in general that should be seen as a positive sign.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Louise, do you want to respond to anything that you heard from Conrad? He did draw attention to the role of the private sector.
Absolutely. I think Conrad raised a very important point on how comfortable these companies are in being involved or implicated in, cases such as Ukraine. I think it's a mix of different elements, right? There is a moral signaling, and I think all of that goes back to kind of the strategic thinking around these companies. And it's not, again, we shouldn't take them as a very coherent kind of enterprise, right? But there are different incentives for them to be engaged. There is a PR kind of perspective of saying that we are doing the right thing because we are, supporting Ukraine. And as time passes by, I think there are trickier bits of that. So just think about Starlink is potentially the most, let's say, notorious example where you have, Elon Musk via Twitter or X just saying that they will support Ukraine by providing, that kind of communications to the Ministry of Defense and to among other, let's say, operational scenarios. And then after a while, going to the US and saying, well, who's going to pay the bill? So we shouldn't take these incentives as static. And I think that goes back to your point, Tim, on strategy as being something that's flexible, that changes in time. And we should be very cautious about how these different companies engage, what's in it for them. So I think one thing is looking at companies engaging in Ukraine. Another thing is looking at when we look at other regions, right? So for example, again, in Latin America, why are some of these companies helping out, like, going to Costa Rica or going to Albania, right? It's because there are existing governance mechanisms that are being shaped where they can go together with different governments that already have MOUs and that they already have a relationship with these governments. So for example, in Ukraine, you have the talent mechanism that was kind of announced by the UK, Estonia, and among others in December 2023. And it says that companies and NGOs are and should be involved in the talent mechanism, right? So I think there's a lot of testing around how do governments frame the role of the private sector in terms of crisis response, and crisis response, international crisis response and cooperation being a very core element of cyber statecraft over here, right? But obviously, there is this question of what are the incentive structures behind that for private companies to be involved? Is it because they're a big defense contractor that has existing relationships with a country that's already kind of forging an MOU with X country, right? And I think that is what we're trying to investigate, is how do these structures facilitate or contest the role of the private sector, or how the private sector itself contests their own the assumption that they will go along, right? And I think that contestation, just to bring that final bit over there, when we look at patching, for example, or remediation of software vulnerabilities, that is a place where it's quite contested, whether private companies align or not with some governments. If we look at patching, or let's say Apple helping different victims of spyware, right, across the world, and saying, this is, you've been targeted, or we've identified that there's malicious activity happening over there. This is a kind of a resistance from the private sector that's potentially not that interesting for some governments, right? When we think about notification of vulnerabilities, and China, for example, passing their 2021 regulations on management of network security or product security vulnerabilities, saying that companies should first notify their vulnerabilities to the government, and then they will decide what to do with it. I think that's a way of trying to force the private sector into doing certain types of things, or having a particular kind of practice that ultimately reinforces cyber statecraft, but that in other places, that's not necessarily the case. So I think we're looking at very contested boundaries over there, and just wanted to react to Conrad's point around incentive structure.